The courtroom was already tense before anyone raised a hand. Wood-paneled walls absorbed the low murmur of lawyers shuffling papers, defendants whispering prayers, and families sitting rigid on narrow benches. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow over a room built to project order, not mercy. This was a place where voices were supposed to be measured, where authority spoke softly because it did not need to shout. At least, that was the idea. Near the front, a black woman stood beside the clerk's desk, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She wore a dark, tailored suit, professional, understated. No robe. No badge. No visible sign of rank. To most eyes, she looked like court staff, maybe an attorney waiting her turn, maybe a public defender juggling too many cases in one morning. She held a folder close to her chest, eyes scanning the courtroom with quiet focus. Across the room, a uniformed court officer shifted his weight, irritation already written across his face. He had been on duty since dawn. Long docket. Short patience. He'd dealt with defendants who talked back, families who asked too many questions, lawyers who acted entitled. In his mind, everyone in this room needed to be reminded who controlled it. His gaze locked onto the woman. She was standing where she wasn't supposed to be. "Hey," he barked, loud enough to turn heads. "You can't stand there." The woman looked up, surprised but composed. "I'm just waiting for," I said. "Move," the officer snapped, striding toward her. His voice carried the practiced sharpness of someone used to being obeyed. Around them, the room quieted. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. A few people leaned forward, sensing friction. Courtrooms trained people to notice shifts in power, and this one was obvious. "I'm authorized to be here," the woman said calmly. Her tone wasn't defiant. It wasn't apologetic either. It was factual. The officer scoffed. "Authorized by who?" She hesitated for half a second, as if deciding whether the explanation was worth the effort. "By the court." That was when his patience snapped. He stepped into her personal space, chest out, hand already raised in a gesture meant to dominate. "You think you can just say that?" And the sound cut through the room like a gunshot. A sharp slap. Flesh against flesh. The woman staggered back a step, the folder slipping from her hands and hitting the floor in a scatter of papers. Gasps rippled through the benches. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God." For a split second, no one moved. The officer stood there, breathing hard, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something darker, satisfaction. In his world, disrespect was a challenge that had to be crushed immediately, publicly. "You do not talk back to me," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Not in my courtroom." The woman didn't shout. She didn't cry. She slowly straightened, one hand touching her cheek where the sting was already blooming. Her eyes lifted to meet his, steady and unflinching. The silence in the room grew heavier. A young law student in the gallery fumbled for his phone, hands shaking. A defendant's mother covered her mouth. Two attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, both knowing they had just witnessed something profoundly wrong, but also knowing how dangerous it could be to speak up. This wasn't just an assault. It was a violation of the very place designed to protect people from that kind of power. The clerk froze, eyes darting between the officer and the woman. Procedure demanded order. Humanity demanded intervention. Fear kept everyone rooted. The officer finally broke the silence again. "Now move," he said, gesturing toward the benches like she belonged there. "Before I remove you myself." The woman took a breath. Not a shaky one. A controlled one. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down and gathered the fallen papers. Her hands were steady. Too steady for someone who had just been struck. As she rose, her voice cut through the room, quiet, measured, unmistakably authoritative. "Officer," she said, "you may want to step back." A few people shifted, sensing something they couldn't yet name. There was no fear in her tone. No pleading. Just calm certainty. The officer laughed under his breath. "You don't give me orders." He had no idea, not yet, and as the courtroom sat suspended in stunned silence, one truth settled heavily in the air. This moment, caught by witnesses and phones and memory, was already far bigger than the slap itself. It was the beginning of something the officer could no longer control. The officer's laughter echoed longer than it should have. It wasn't loud, but it was confident, the kind of laugh that assumed the room was already on his side. He turned slightly, as if inviting the benches to share in the joke, reinforcing the unspoken hierarchy he relied on every day. Uniform. Badge. Authority. He had those. She did not. See, he said, gesturing vaguely. This is what happens when people forget where they are. The woman said nothing. She stepped aside just enough to allow others to pass, though no one moved. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than words ever could. You think you're special, he continued, voice rising. You think because you wear a suit, you get to ignore instructions. She finally spoke again, still controlled. I think you've made a serious mistake. A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Not agreement, recognition. The kind that came when tension crossed an invisible threshold. The officer's jaw tightened. That's enough, he said. I'm done playing games. He reached for his radio, thumb pressing the button with deliberate force. I need assistance up front. Non-compliant individual. The phrase landed hard. Non-compliant. A word that had justified too many escalations, too many broken bones, too many reports that read clean while lives did not. Two more court officers appeared from the side door, moving quickly, eyes scanning for threat. They saw a black woman standing alone, hands at her sides, face composed. They saw their colleague squared up, dominant, waiting to be backed. What's the issue? One asked. She refuses to follow instructions, the first officer said. He did not mention the slap. He didn't need to. His version of events already carried weight. I'm not refusing, the woman said evenly. I'm asking that this be handled properly. Properly, the officer snapped. You assaulted an officer's authority. That drew a sharp inhale from somewhere in the gallery. Assaulted authority. Not assaulted an officer. Authority itself. The room understood the distinction, even if no one dared articulate it. The second officer glanced at the woman's face, at the faint red mark forming on her cheek. His eyes flicked back to his colleague, questioning, but not questioning enough. Ma'am, he said cautiously, we're going to need you to step back in. No, she replied. It was a single word. Calm. Clear. Unraised. That word shifted the air. The first officer took a step forward again. You don't get to say no here. Several phones were now visible, lifted just above laps, recording without spectacle. The red glow of tiny screens reflected off polished wood. No one announced it. No one needed to. Everyone understood the risk and the necessity. The woman's gaze swept the room, briefly acknowledging the witnesses, the cameras, the clerks, the attorneys. When she spoke again, it was not just to the officers. This courtroom is in session, she said. And your behavior is compromising its integrity. The phrase landed differently this time. Not emotional. Procedural, the officer sneered. You think you sound important? I think I sound correct. That was when he lost control completely. Enough, he barked. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Gasps broke out openly now. A defendant stood halfway, instinctively, before his lawyer pulled him back down. The clerk's hands trembled over the keyboard. The woman did not turn around. She stood exactly where she was. You are escalating a situation you already mishandled, she said. I strongly advise you to stop. The irony went unnoticed by him. He had never been advised by someone like her before, not in a way that mattered. He reached out again, fingers brushing her arm. Don't touch me, she said, her voice sharpened, not louder, but heavier. The second officer hesitated. Hey, he muttered to his colleague. Maybe we should slow down. Don't tell me how to do my job, the first officer snapped back. That exchange, small as it was, fractured the unity he depended on. Doubt crept in. The room felt it. The woman inhaled slowly, visibly steadying herself. When she spoke next, her words were deliberate, almost formal. For the record, she said, I am ordering you to disengage. The officer laughed again, louder this time. You don't order me to do anything. A phone camera zoomed slightly. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, who is she? No one answered. The tension had moved beyond personal conflict. It now sat squarely in the realm of institutional failure, playing out in real time. The bailiff at the door shifted uneasily. He had seen judges reprimand officers before, but never like this, never from someone without a robe. The first officer grabbed the woman's wrist. That was the moment everything crossed a line that could not be walked back. Let go, she said. That he didn't. The room erupted, not in shouting, but in sound. Chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. Someone shouted for security, forgetting who security already was. The woman pulled her hand free, not violently, but decisively. You are now interfering with judicial proceedings, she said. Step away. The officer's face flushed red. That's it. He turned to his colleagues. Detain her. They hesitated, just for a second. That it was enough, because in that hesitation lived the first crack, the realization that something was wrong, that the script they followed might not apply here. And in that charged pause, before hands moved again, before authority doubled down, the woman did something no one expected. She reached into her folder, not for a weapon, not for an ID, for something far more dangerous to unchecked power. The courtroom leaned forward as one, breath held, unaware that the escalation they had just witnessed was only setting the stage for a reversal that would shake the room to its core. The room did not erupt the way courtrooms do in movies. There was no shouting chorus, no dramatic rush forward. Instead, the disorder came in restrained fragments, half-risen bodies, clipped whispers, the sharp click of a pen dropped onto hardwood. Authority was misfiring, and everyone could feel it, even if no one could yet name it. The first officer tightened his grip on the situation by tightening his voice. This is your last warning, he said, speaking past the woman now, projecting to the room. Anyone interfering will be removed. Removed. Another word heavy with precedent. The woman stood still, the folder open in her hands now, pages exposed. Not waving them. Not displaying them. Simply holding them, as though their existence alone mattered. You don't get to threaten the public for witnessing misconduct, she said. Misconduct, he repeated, incredulous. You assaulted my authority and refused lawful orders. The phrase came out practiced, almost rehearsed. Lawful orders. In his mind, saying it made it true. One of the other officers shifted again, uneasy. Maybe we should call a supervisor. I am the supervisor here, the first officer snapped. That was not true, but it was close enough to pass most days. The woman glanced briefly toward the clerk. Please note, she said calmly, that the officer has struck a civilian inside an active courtroom and is now attempting an unlawful detention. The clerk swallowed. Her fingers hovered, then began typing. The keystroke sounded absurdly loud. Stop talking, the officer barked. You're not running this. The woman's eyes returned to him. Neither are you. That answer drew a sharp breath from the benches. It wasn't the words. It was the certainty behind them. The officer stepped closer again, crowding her space. You don't even know how close you are to jail right now. I know exactly where I am, she replied. And I know exactly what you're doing. He laughed once more, but it came out strained. You think this little performance is going to help you? He turned to the other officers. Cuff her. They did not move. The pause stretched longer this time. Cameras stayed steady. Witnesses leaned forward. Even those who had once looked away were now watching intently, drawn by the slow unraveling of control. Now, he ordered. One officer took a tentative step, then stopped. His eyes flicked again to the woman's face, to the papers in her hands, to the mark on her cheek. This doesn't feel right, he muttered. The first officer rounded on him. You questioning me? I'm saying, then stop saying it. The woman spoke into the fracture. You are attempting to enforce authority you do not have, she said. And every second you continue makes this worse. Shut up, the officer snapped. That single command, shouted inside a courtroom, landed harder than the slap had. It violated the space itself. Even judges rarely raised their voices like that. An attorney stood. Slowly. Deliberately, officer, he said, choosing his words with care, I believe this situation requires. Sit down, the officer barked without looking. This doesn't concern you. The attorney hesitated, then sat. Fear won. It always did, until it didn't. The woman turned slightly, addressing the room again. You are all witnessing this, she said. And you will be asked to remember it. The officer pointed at her. You see? She's inciting. No, she said. I'm documenting. That word seemed to hit something he hadn't armored. He reached again for her arm, harder this time, fingers digging in. Do not touch me again, she said, her voice now unmistakably cold. Or what? He challenged. The woman met his stare. Or you will answer for it. He scoffed. To who? For the first time, she did not answer immediately. She looked down at the folder, then back up, as if measuring the room's readiness. The tension thickened, not with chaos, but with anticipation. Before she could speak, the officer pulled his cuffs free, the metal clinking loudly. That's it, he said. Turn around. Several people gasped outright now. A woman in the second row shook her head in disbelief. Someone whispered, this is insane. The second officer stepped in at last, placing a hand on his colleague's arm. Stop, he said quietly. We're way past protocol. The first officer yanked his arm free. Get out of my way. Protocol. Another word, now weaponized in both directions. You're going to regret this, the officer told the woman, leaning in close enough that only she could hear. People like you always do. The implication hung heavy. The woman did not flinch. People like you, she said softly, always underestimate who's watching. The cuffs hung open in his hand. Last chance, he said. She lifted the top page from the folder. It wasn't an ID yet. It was a court order, embossed, signed, official. The seal caught the overhead light. This proceeding is compromised, she said, reading aloud. Due to officer misconduct. The officer stared at the page, confused more than threatened. You can't just read things and make them real. She lowered the paper slightly. That's exactly how the law works. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Recognition. Suspicion. Something shifting. The officer hesitated for the first time, cuffs still open, authority suddenly less solid in his grip. He didn't know it yet, but the misuse of power had reached its peak, and peaks, by their nature, are followed by falls. The officer stared at the document like it was written in another language. Put that down, he said, but the command lacked its earlier force. It sounded reflexive now, a habit rather than authority. The woman did not comply. Instead, she stepped forward, one measured step, bringing the paper into the light where everyone could see the seal clearly. The raised emblem caught the fluorescent glare, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in a courtroom. This order, she said calmly, was issued this morning. The clerk froze mid-typing. The other officers leaned in despite themselves. The first officer scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. You think flashing paperwork scares me? I'm not flashing anything, she replied. I'm invoking it. That phrasing landed differently. Lawyers in the room straightened. One of them recognized the seal immediately. His brow furrowed. The woman turned slightly, angling the page toward the clerk. Please verify the docket entry. The clerk swallowed hard and glanced at her screen. Her fingers moved faster now, not out of fear, but recognition. Her eyes widened. The officer noticed. Don't, he warned the clerk. This isn't, it's already logged, the clerk said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room stilled. What's logged? The officer demanded. The clerk hesitated, then looked up at the woman instead of him. The reassignment, she said. That single word cracked the atmosphere. The woman folded the paper neatly and placed it back into the folder. Only then did she look directly at the officer. "You were briefed this morning," she said. "You signed in." "I sign in every morning," he snapped. "That doesn't mean," "It means," she interrupted gently, "that you failed to read the notice posted at the security desk." The second officer's eyes widened. He turned sharply toward his colleague. "There was a notice." The first officer stiffened. "That's irrelevant." "No," the woman said. "It's critical." She reached into the folder again. This time, she removed a simple identification card. No badge theatrics. No dramatic flourish. She held it at chest level, angled outward. Several people gasped softly. The attorney who had stood earlier inhaled sharply. That's a judicial ID." The officer squinted. "That doesn't prove anything." The woman met his gaze. "Read the name." He didn't move. "Read it," she said again, firmer now, though still calm. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, the officer leaned forward, eyes scanning the card, his face drained of color. The cuffs slipped slightly in his hand. "No," he said quietly. "That's not possible." The woman slid the ID back into the folder. "I am the presiding judge assigned to this courtroom today," she said. "I chose not to wear the robe yet." The room erupted, not in noise, but in reaction. Shock rippled through every bench. Mouths fell open. Heads turned sharply toward the officer. The clerk stood abruptly. "All rise," she said instinctively, then stopped, unsure. The woman raised a hand. "Remain seated." The command carried undeniable authority now, not imposed, but revealed. The first officer took a step back without realizing it. "You should have said something." "I did," she replied. "Multiple times." "You should have told me who you were." "I told you where I was authorized to stand," she said. "That should have been enough." He shook his head, scrambling. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," she said evenly. "This is exactly what it appears to be." She turned to the other officers. "You are dismissed from this interaction." They didn't hesitate. They stepped back immediately, eyes down, shame written across their faces. The first officer stood alone now, exposed in the center of the room. "You slapped me," the judge continued, her voice steady, echoing through the courtroom. "You attempted to detain me. You threatened witnesses. And you did so inside a courtroom you are sworn to protect." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Phones were no longer hidden. "No one cared. I want the record to reflect," she said, turning slightly toward the clerk, "that Officer Daniel Reeves initiated physical contact without cause." The clerk nodded, typing rapidly, tears pooling in her eyes. The officer's name, spoken aloud, seemed to shrink him. "You humiliated me," he said suddenly, desperation bleeding through. "You set me up." The judge looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice softened, not with mercy, but clarity. "I stood quietly in my own courtroom," she said. "You did the rest." She gestured toward the door. "Remove your equipment. You are relieved of duty pending investigation." He laughed weakly. "You can't just." "I can," she said. "And I have." The bailiff moved immediately. Another officer approached, this time to escort Reeves, not her. As he was guided away, his eyes darted around the room, searching for support that no longer existed. "This court is in recess," the judge said. "Effective immediately." She paused, then added, "Security footage, witness statements, and all recordings will be preserved." That sentence sealed his fate. As Reeves disappeared through the side door, the courtroom sat in stunned silence, absorbing the reversal they had just witnessed. Power had not shouted. It had waited, and then, calmly, it had stood up. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded the way institutions unravel, slowly, methodically, and in full view. Once the first thread was pulled, within minutes of the courtroom clearing, the judge was no longer alone. A senior clerk escorted her into chambers, hands still trembling, voice tight with disbelief. The mark on the judge's cheek had deepened, a visible reminder that the morning was no longer just procedural, it was evidentiary. Outside, the hallway buzzed with restrained chaos. Court staff whispered in clusters. Attorneys checked their phones, messages already stacking. Someone had uploaded the video. No caption. No commentary. Just footage, the slap, the commands, the pause, the reveal. By the time Officer Daniel Reeves reached the security office, his name was already circulating far beyond the courthouse walls. He sat stiffly in a plastic chair, duty belt removed, hands resting uselessly on his thighs. A supervisor stood across from him, arms crossed, eyes hard. "Tell me exactly what happened," the supervisor said. Reeves swallowed. "She was non-compliant." The supervisor didn't respond. "She didn't identify herself," Reeves added quickly. "She refused orders." The supervisor leaned forward slightly. "Did you strike her?" Reeves hesitated, then nodded. "She was being disrespectful." "That was the wrong answer. In chambers, the judge gave her statement calmly, precisely. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She described actions, times, words. Each sentence tightened the record like a knot. I verbally asserted authorization. I was struck without warning. I ordered disengagement. I displayed a judicial order. I identified myself." The Internal Affairs representative listened without interruption, recording everything. When she finished, he asked one question: "Were there witnesses?" The judge met his eyes. An entire courtroom. By noon, Reeves was officially suspended without pay pending investigation. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse released a statement acknowledging a serious incident involving court security personnel and confirming that an inquiry was underway. By evening, that statement was irrelevant. The video had reached millions. It played silently on screens across the country. No narration, no music. Viewers didn't need guidance. The imbalance was obvious. The slap was unmistakable. The shift in power unmistakably earned, not claimed. Comment sections filled with a rare mix of outrage and restraint. Not fury alone, but recognition. She never raised her voice. He had every chance to stop. This is why procedure matters. That calm scared him more than shouting ever could. Legal analysts weighed in. Former judges. Retired officers. Civil rights attorneys. They all said the same thing in different language: this wasn't a mistake. This was culture. Within 48 hours, Internal Affairs had secured every angle of footage: body cameras, hallway cameras, security feeds. Reeves' own camera told a damning story. The audio captured his commands clearly. His tone. His escalation. The moment of impact, there was no gap. No ambiguity. When Reeves was called in for his formal interview, his lawyer sat beside him, quiet but alert. "You understand the severity of this," the investigator said. Reeves nodded stiffly. "You understand that striking a presiding judge inside a courtroom constitutes criminal assault." Reeves' jaw tightened. "I didn't know who she was." The investigator didn't flinch. "That is not a defense." Across the city, the judge returned to the bench days later. This time, she wore the robe. The courtroom rose as one. Her cheek had healed, but the moment had not faded. She addressed the room before proceedings began. "Not emotionally. Not politically. Authority exists to serve justice," she said. "Not to replace it." She said nothing more. The consequences continued to expand outward. Reeves was formally charged with misdemeanor assault and official misconduct. His union issued a brief statement asserting due process, then fell silent as evidence mounted. The courthouse placed 3 supervisors on administrative leave for failure to intervene and failure to enforce posted judicial notices. Mandatory retraining was ordered, but that was only the surface. The deeper reckoning came when witnesses were called. Clerks testified to intimidation. Attorneys testified to fear. Defendants' families testified to silence. Learned the hard way. One by one, they described a pattern. Not just Reeves, but an environment where authority went unquestioned because questioning carried risk. The judge listened to every statement from the bench, face composed, hands folded. When the hearing concluded, she issued a ruling that went beyond Reeves alone. The conduct displayed was not isolated, she said. It was enabled. That sentence rippled through the system. Reeves eventually entered a plea. No cameras this time. No crowd. Just a quiet courtroom and a record that would follow him. His badge was surrendered permanently. His career ended not with drama, but with documentation, and yet, the consequences did not end there. The video became required viewing in judicial training programs across multiple states. Not as spectacle, but as instruction, law enforcement agencies revised protocols for court security interactions. Clearer chains of command. Mandatory identification verification. Immediate disengagement rules when judicial authority is asserted, but perhaps the most significant consequence was the least visible. People who had watched the video, clerks, defendants, junior attorneys, began to speak differently about power. They spoke about calm, about precision, about knowing the rules better than those who abused them. Weeks later, the judge addressed a group of new court officers during training. She did not mention Reeves by name. She said only this: "You will never know who is watching you. And you should behave as if that person matters." The room was silent, because now, they understood, justice had not needed to shout. It had simply waited for accountability to catch up. The reform did not announce itself with slogans or ceremonies. It arrived in memoranda, policy drafts, closed-door meetings, and language that sounded dry to anyone who didn't understand its weight. But inside those documents lived the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had broken, and been exposed. Within weeks of the incident, the State Judicial Oversight Committee convened an emergency review of courtroom security operations. Not because of public pressure alone, but because the evidence left no room for denial. The video had shown what internal reports had softened for years. Unchecked authority did not need chaos to be dangerous. It only needed silence. The committee's findings were blunt. Court officers had been trained to control bodies, not situations. De-escalation protocols existed on paper, not in practice. Judicial authority was assumed to be visible, not respected by default, and most critically, misconduct was routinely addressed privately, allowing patterns to persist unchallenged. The judge's case became the fulcrum. Not because she was a judge, but because she had been treated as if she were not. That detail forced an uncomfortable question into every discussion room: if this could happen to her, what happened to everyone else? New directives followed. Court security officers were no longer permitted to initiate physical contact inside a courtroom without explicit judicial instruction, regardless of perceived disrespect. Verbal noncompliance was reclassified, not as a threat, but as a procedural issue requiring pause, not force. Identification protocols were rewritten. Officers were required to verify authority before issuing commands, not after resistance occurred. Notices posted at security desks were no longer optional reading. They became mandatory briefings, signed and digitally logged. Supervisors were assigned personal accountability for failures under their watch. Not symbolic responsibility, career-impacting accountability. The culture shifted subtly, but unmistakably. In training rooms, the video was played again, not to shame, but to dissect. Recruits watched the moment frame by frame. The slap. The hesitation. The reveal. Instructors stopped the footage before the ID appeared. What should have happened here? They asked, and for the first time, the answer wasn't obedience. It was restraint. The judge herself did not campaign. She did not give interviews. She did not write op-eds. Her influence came through rulings, through precedent, through the careful use of the bench she had always occupied. In subsequent cases involving alleged misconduct by court personnel, she applied a new standard, one grounded not in intent, but in impact. How did your actions affect the integrity of the court? She would ask. That question reframed accountability. It wasn't about whether an officer felt threatened. It was about whether justice had been compromised. Other judges began to adopt the language. Clerks noticed. Attorneys noticed. Officers noticed. The system, long resistant to introspection, began to recalibrate, not dramatically, but durably. Outside the courthouse, advocacy groups used the case as a reference point. Not as outrage, but as evidence. They cited it in policy meetings, in training proposals, in funding requests for oversight mechanisms. This is what unchecked authority looks like, they said, and this is what correction looks like. Perhaps the most meaningful reform happened quietly. Reporting channels were redesigned so that clerks and junior staff could document misconduct without routing complaints through the very supervisors implicated in them. Anonymous reporting was no longer treated as disloyalty, but as early warning. The number of internal reports increased sharply. So did early interventions. Incidents that once would have escalated now stalled, redirected by officers newly aware that every action left a trace, not just on camera, but on record. Months later, a new officer stood in that same courtroom for the first time. Different uniform. Same walls. Same benches. A woman stood near the clerk's desk, holding a folder. The officer paused. Instead of barking an order, he asked a question. "Ma'am, are you authorized to be here?" She nodded. "Yes." "Thank you," he said, stepping back. No one noticed, and that was the point, the judge observed from the bench, expression neutral. Reform was not loud. It was procedural. It was invisible when it worked. At a judicial conference later that year, her case was referenced indirectly. No names, no video. A senior judge summarized it in a single line: power should never depend on how loud it speaks. The room was quiet, because everyone understood what had changed, and what still required vigilance. The system had not been healed, but it had been corrected, and correction, unlike outrage, had a chance to last. The courtroom looked the same as it always had: same benches. Same seal. Same quiet expectation that justice would move forward whether anyone noticed it or not. On the surface, nothing marked it as the place where authority had once overreached and been corrected, but the people inside it were different. They listened differently now. They watched more closely. They understood that power did not vanish when exposed, it adjusted, retreated, recalibrated. The judge stood at the bench at the end of the day, robe folded over her arm, preparing to leave. A clerk lingered nearby, hesitant. "Your Honor," she said softly, "thank you." The judge paused. "For what?" "For not letting it go," the clerk replied. The judge considered that for a moment. "I didn't hold on to it," she said. "I put it where it belonged." Outside the courthouse, life moved on. Traffic passed. Phones buzzed. News cycles shifted. Another story replaced this one, louder, messier, easier to consume, but this story did not need to stay loud to remain true. Its impact lived in changed behavior, in pauses where commands once flew, in questions asked instead of assumptions made. It lived in the understanding that justice does not always arrive dramatically, but it does arrive when rules are respected by everyone, especially those entrusted to enforce them. The officer who once believed authority was something you imposed learned otherwise. Too late for his career, but not too late for the record. The judge who stood quietly in her own courtroom never sought to become a symbol. She remained what she had always been, a guardian of process, of dignity, of restraint, and the people who witnessed it, in person or through a screen, carried something forward with them: not anger, clarity, the clarity that calm is not weakness, that procedure is not bureaucracy, it is protection, that accountability does not require shouting, only persistence. That if this story resonates, it is not because of the slap. It is because of what followed, because justice did not rush. It did not retaliate. It did not perform. It documented. It corrected. It endured, and the next time authority is tested, quietly, casually, without warning, the outcome will depend on who remembers that power is not proven by force, but by restraint. If you believe accountability matters, share stories like this. Not to inflame, but to remind. Not to divide, but to clarify, because the most lasting reform begins when people refuse to look away, and choose instead to understand how justice actually works.